Hi everyone, welcome back to North Fork Ranch. I've been growing different kinds of fruit for over 40 years. Here at North Fork Ranch we have 26 different kinds of fruit and multiple varieties of many of those. Such as apples, we have 45 varieties, many of which are heirlooms. We have 12 kinds of pears, 6 of peaches, 7 of plums, and 5 varieties of figs. Other kind of tree fruits we grow are persimmons, papas, sea berries, shapova, maki berries, pineapple guavas, and luma. Many of the kinds of fruit you've probably never heard of before, and we will feature them in later videos, especially when the fruit is ripening and when they're in bloom. And vines we have our grapes, raspberries, strawberries, akebia, and bitternata. We also have a couple of walnuts and almonds and a few hazelnuts. Today I'll demonstrate fruit thinning and maybe do a little bit of summer pruning also. Normally peaches require heavy thinning, but this last winter we had a lot of cold rainy weather during the bloom and there wasn't much fruit set. As you can see, there's only a few fruit, and those will get really good size because the tree isn't very heavily loaded. These leaves, this is peach leaf curl. Now we grow varieties that are curl resistant or immune. If not, the whole tree would be defoliated, and after a couple of years of that, would usually die. So all of our peach varieties are peach leaf curl resistant because of our moist, rainy climate. When you're thinning peaches, all you have to do is use your fingers and give a little twist, and what you want to take off comes off. These I'm taking off because they're kind of a Siamese twin, and those will usually spoil and not ripen properly. And now that single peach will have all the space to sizen up. This peach tree actually did have a little more fruit set, but it is a smaller, younger tree, and so you don't want to leave too many on it. So generally, peaches, you thin them to about 6 inches apart on the branches, and that can depend on just how heavily loaded the tree is. I'll take off all these little ones because they're way behind on these bigger ones. And here where there's a couple, I'll leave the bigger one. There's like a whole cluster of them that are all like triples. This one variety often has doubles and triples and all, which is a one fault with the variety, but it's called a Charlotte peach. It also is more resistant to canker, and it is peach leaf curl resistant also. We grow our fruit trees in a permaculture type style with a mixture of a lot of different varieties because there's less disease and insect damage than in a monoculture where all the fruit is all of one same variety. Here we have pears, they're peaches, and figs interspaced in between. We also let the wildflowers grow up between mowings because this attracts a lot of beneficial insects that feed on the nectar and the pollen of the flowers. Many of those are also predators that eat the harmful insects. Also, it provides more pollen and nectar for our bees. Different kinds and different varieties of fruit also extends your harvest season, where you have some kind of fruit coming in multiple times of the year. This is a Basque pear tree, the kind that has like a russet skin that you may have seen in the supermarkets. And thinning these, it's best to use clippers so you don't damage the fruiting spurs. How many you want to take off depends not only on how close together they are, but just how much fruit is on the tree total for how much it's going to carry. Because if there's a lot of spaces without much fruit, you can leave some closer together where they are. So I'll just remove just a couple out of there. And usually where there's like 2 together, it's good to remove one as long as there's some others that are nearby. Now with pears and apples, some varieties will have problems with scab in our climate. The pears we were just thinning, the Basque pears, they're scab immune. But this tree right here, which is one of our few big older trees, is a Bartlett pear, and it can have some problem with scab. And so when thinning them, One thing you look for is if you find like real scabby fruit, when the fruit's big and ripe, it's going to have a real rough area there with maybe cracks, which can rot on the fruit. So part of thinning here is take off the extra scabby ones first, and then the next thing you look for is nice big ones that you would leave and just take off smaller ones that are closer to it, because then you'll end up with a bigger fruit. Now the reason you want bigger fruit is because when a tree sets a whole lot of fruit, it spends more energy growing skin and seeds, and you actually end up with less of the edible fruit total from the tree. The fewer bigger fruit give you a lot more fruit. Now at the same time, you can thin according to what size of fruit you like, because like especially on apples, if you have small children, they don't usually eat a whole big apple, and so you might leave more on it so that they turn out to be more medium size. And for us, our juicer fits a medium apple in whole, where a large one we'd have to cut it into quarters. So it's a lot faster and easier to juice medium to a little bit small size apples. Now for most of the thinning on this tree that I'll do, I'll need to use a ladder, and I probably won't bother to thin the whole tree. Now this year our apples had a lot of fruit set, because apples are a little later blooming than the peaches, and so the weather was more favorable while they were in bloom. This is a wine sap apple, and this year it's going to need a lot of heavy thinning. Most apples fruit on spurs, and you can leave, usually if you want the big supermarket fruit, you leave like one per spur. For a juicer especially, we like a more medium size. I'll normally leave two depending on how close together the spurs are. You can see the spurs are like a little thick twiggy part, and it has a cluster of blossoms when it's in bloom, and then that's where the apple's set. But I'll go through and pick out the smallest ones to snip off first, and any that might have any insect damage or a little bit of scab on that one. A lot of these spurs I'll only leave one on because of how close together they all are, and the branch would have quite a heavy load if I was leaving more per spur. The most important reason that you need to thin fruit when there's such a heavy set as this is that the branches will break under the weight of the fruit before they ripen after they've been sizening up. It doesn't normally require this much thinning, but we had just an extra heavy fruit set this year. So all four of those apples are off of one spur, and you don't want to damage the spurs, which is why I carefully clip the stems off with the clippers, because the same spur on an apple fruits every year. And so if you don't know what you're doing and you try to prune an apple as if it was a grape and you cut it way back, you can cut off all your spurs and then not have any fruit the next year. Sometimes you might thin over your tree, and then you might come back in a couple days and decide you might want to take a little more off of it than you are on the one day, and that's always fine. And normally not all the flowers pollinate, and so you don't usually end up with such a heavy fruit load as we did this year. But then this year we don't have to spend time doing a bunch of thinning on the peaches, which we normally have to do, and we don't normally have to do so much on the apples. This tree here was one that I grafted 4 different varieties on. You can see the grafts here. This was a bigger branch, and I used a side bark graft. And this one is a cleft graft, where you split the one branch, and then you, after shaping the scion into a wedge shape, you slide it in there. In the wintertime, we'll do another video showing you how to do the grafting. And this one we could do a little bit of summer pruning on also. Most of the pruning is in the winter or early spring when the trees don't have any leaves. But in the summer you can take out sideways branches or suckers, or like this one, there's too many it's getting too thick with too many branches going the same way. And here we want it growing out and not up. So take a couple of those vigorous shoots off, and then the tree will put more energy into growing the branches outwardly the way you want them. You want to keep the middle of a tree more open, so you don't really want these branches crossing from these over the top of those, or they'll shade them out. So you basically prune your trees into kind of a vase shape where there's 4 or 5 main limbs going out in all the different directions, and it's kind of open in the middle. But most of that pruning we do in the winter when there's no leaves on the trees, and so we're not taking away a bunch of the energy the trees already put into growing like the summer pruning does. This is a Chehalis apple, which is a nice yellow sweeter apple and resistant to apple scab. I take off the smaller ones first, and once again we don't want such a heavy load that'll break the branches. Most of our trees are semi-dwarf trees, which means they won't get as big as that big old Bartlett was that we were thinning on earlier, and easier to manage. Though I do like the look of great big fruit trees, so having 1 or 2 around is nice to look at. But as far as working them, it's a lot easier when you have the semi-dwarf. I don't really recommend getting completely dwarfed apple or any kind of fruit because they have such a shallow roots that they require a lot more careful watering. They can't withstand drought, and they'll topple over a lot easier even though they are a small tree. This variety of apple is another heirloom. It's called a Ribston Pippin. It's a stronger flavored apple for those who like a rich flavor that's not as sweet. It's also a good drying apple. We dry a lot of these. You can see a little bit of difference in the look of the foliage between some of the different varieties of apples. This one has a little more of a silvery gray look. This is a Gravenstein apple, and different kinds of apples have a different bloom time during the bloom season. There's early, mid, and late bloomers, and usually they overlap each other. The Gravenstein happens to be an early bloomer, and this year it has a nice fruit set, but it doesn't really have a lot that needs thinned like some of the other varieties did. The plums, like the peaches, are an early bloomer, Japanese plums, and so we had light to little crops on most of the plums. But this here is a European plum, a Brooks plum, and they bloom later than Japanese plums. And so this one did have a heavy fruit set and needs quite a bit of thinning. And the clippers is good because the plum also sets on sprues. And so the general rule is to have most of your fruits be like about 6 inches apart. I usually can't bring myself to to make them all that far apart because it's always hard to think about snipping off that much fruit. But if you want them nice and big, you go ahead and you cut them further apart. This is a Hollywood variety Japanese plum with red leaves, which is a very good way to add color to your landscaping while still getting fruit. When it's in bloom, the flowers have a pinkish tinge and it grows a nice red fruit. And even though it is an early bloomer, it set fruit pretty well this year, but not enough to require any thinning. In later videos, we'll feature many of the different kinds of fruit that we have, such as maki berries, which are higher in antioxidants than any other food tested, and like these fiojas, commonly called pineapple guavas, which are a very pretty ornamental tree with green on top of the leaves, silvery underneath. Right now they have their flower buds, and when they're in bloom, they're covered with fuchsia-like flowers The fruit that grow on these pineapple guavas has a very delicious flavor that tastes kind of like spearmint and pineapples combined. So if you would like to learn more about a lot of these varieties, we'll do later videos on harvesting, when to pick them at the peak of ripeness, and in winter and early spring we'll do videos on how to prune and how to graft. Also in later videos we'll talk about harvesting, how and when to pick different kinds of fruit at the peak of flavor. If you don't want to miss any of these videos, hit the subscribe and like, and we'll see you in future videos.